In the winter of 1914, the war seemed a world away from Scarborough. True, the outbreak of hostilities on the eve of August Bank Holiday had ruined a promising holiday season. All rail excursions had been cancelled. Unofficial rationing was in force. Some of the younger men had gone off to France. But few could really see how the murder of an obscure Austrian archduke could affect their lives. Scarborough looked and felt at peace.
I stooped down to get a ladle of meal to give to the chickens, and the ground seemed to lift to meet me. And with that, of course, I just stood up and looked straight out to sea. I saw a battle cruiser, 2 funnels, steaming towards Scarborough, and a terrific flash, gun flash again, from in front of this ship and this ship, and then I see a third ship coming into view, and they were all firing, broadside after broadside, gun flash after gun flash.
It was when we got up in the morning. We'd just had our breakfast, and there was a terrific amount of banging, awful noise. We couldn't make out what it was. With the railway being at the back of us in the goods depot, we thought it was that. And Mother was ill at the time in bed, and she called down to us to ask what the noise was. And we said, well, we didn't know. So she got out of bed, looked out of the window, and saw a shell explode over the goods depot. So she immediately put a coat on and came downstairs to us. And we were really absolutely terrified. We didn't know what to think.
2 German cruisers, the Derflinger and the Von der Tann, had slunk into the South Bay here and begun shelling the town. That bombardment was to last just 35 minutes, but it was to wreak a terrible toll of death and destruction on Scarborough. The 2 battle cruisers and an accompanying light cruiser, the Kolberg, were part of a larger force under Rear Admiral von Hipper. Leaving the German coast at dusk, the force, 4 battle cruisers, 2 cruisers and 2 destroyer flotillas, rendezvoused off Heligoland. Warned by intercepted signals, British warships under Admirals Warrender and Beatty had been sent to head off the German force at the Dogger Bank. But the engagement, fought before first light in a swirling mist, was inconclusive. The ships of both sides blundered about in the dark, unsure of who they were firing at, and British and German losses were both light. With visibility getting worse, the Germans slipped through. 3 ships, the Seydlitz, the Moltke and the Blücher, shelled Hartlepool. 95 people were killed, over 400 injured. More than 300 buildings were damaged or destroyed. Further south, the Derflinger, the Von der Tann and the Kolberg struck at Scarborough. The people of Scarborough were quite unprepared for the bombardment that followed. Some thought the noise came from Royal Naval ships at gunnery practice. Others thought there was a thunderstorm. So nobody bothered to take cover, and until the shells actually began to explode in the town, everybody just carried on with the normal course of business.
And we went out into the streets because there were these big bangers going. And then went up street, someone was arguing it was about, let's see. Then there was another big bang, and I knew no more. I was in hospital.
Alfred Beale, a postman, was on his rounds in Filey Road when the bombardment began. At a house called Donnelly, he was handing a letter to a maid when a shell exploded, killing both of them instantly. 16 shells hit the house, destroying the library. This book, salvaged from the ruins of the room, has been preserved. A shell splinter is still lodged in it. A milkman on his rounds had just left his horse and cart to take some milk to a house when he turned, just in time to see a shell explode, killing the horse, damaging the cart. Both he and the milk were totally unharmed.
People were coming away from the centre of the town. I think they rather panicked. Instead of staying there where they were safe, they were running into danger. One lady was running up the street here, just dressed in a nightdress, and my mother went out and brought her in and asked her to stay, but she wouldn't. And so we gave her clothing, a long black skirt and a shawl, and she went away up into the street, and that was the last we saw of her.
The Grand Hotel, with its imposing position on the seafront, was an easy target for the German gunners. 36 shells hit the hotel and the restaurant. The cost of the damage was estimated at more than £13,000. Fortunately, the summer season was long gone and Christmas was still a week away, so there were in fact only 2 people staying in that huge hotel at the time. Even so, there were some quite amazing escapes. A shell burst in a waiter's room only minutes after he'd left it. In another room, the only thing left standing was the head of the bedstead. Nearby, another of Scarborough's famous hotels, the Royal, was also damaged. The shell which hit it is believed to have first struck the municipal buildings across the road. The official German account of the raid described Scarborough as a fortified town. But its only visible defences were the ruins of the famous castle, built to withstand medieval armies, not modern guns. The castle walls, 10 feet thick, were hit in several places by shells. The castle itself was damaged, and the old barracks on Castle Hill, at that time unoccupied and used as a store, were virtually destroyed. Despite the intensity of the bombardment, the number of casualties was relatively small. In one sense, Scarborough was very lucky. If the shelling had come half an hour later, there'd have been lots more people on their way to work, the number of casualties would have been that much greater. The timing of the raid prevented a disaster at Gladstone Road School, which was hit by several shells. One went through the roof into the school hall, where half an hour later, hundreds of children were due to assemble. One of them was Mrs. Wood.
The classroom where I would have been had I been at school received a direct hit. And I think had the bombardment come later, there are a great many people who are living today who wouldn't have been there at all, because we should certainly have been in the remnants of the school.
Further up Gladstone Road at number 55, there was another remarkable escape. A single shell wrecked 2 bedrooms, but the 6 people in the house all escaped without injury. As one man ran out, his jacket was caught by a flying shell. It tore his sleeve in 3 places, but he was unhurt.
I couldn't make you believe how terrified we were, because I mean, I was only 12 years old, but I was really an old 12 in one way, you see, because I had to mother the others. And when you heard them talking, they said afterwards, like, we always thought it was an invasion, you see, that day, because we never thought that could happen to us, you see.
In the confusion which reigned, rumours spread quickly. Many feared the bombardment was the springboard for a German invasion. For some time after the shelling had ceased, roads inland were thronged with motor vehicles and horse carts. Scarborough Station was reportedly crowded with people clutching their belongings, some still in their nightclothes. They packed the trains to Hull, to York, to Leeds, to anywhere to get away from danger.
My father was an engine driver. He was at work at the time, and of course he was worried about us, so he came home to find if we were still all right. And his first thought was to get us away, and we hastily packed a bag and went to the station. There were lots of people all with the same intention there. I don't know whether they all caught the train to Pickering or not, but the feeling I had was that people wanted to get away from Scarborough in case the Germans had landed.
So this Mr. Harper sent word to say we could all go on his lorry, which was a light lorry, and well, she just shut the house and left it.
One shell hit a house in Wycombe Street. 7 people lived there. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, their 2 sons, 2 young children, and an old lady lodger. Mrs. Bennett, 1 son, and the 2 children were killed. The father and the other son were seriously injured. The old lady escaped unhurt. In Commercial Street, about a mile inland, an 80-year-old woman and a badly injured daughter were found huddled in the ruins of their home, 7 hours after the bombardment had ended. The saddest story of all is that of Sergeant Sturdy, a regular soldier from Scarborough. He hadn't seen his fiancée, Ada Crow, for 8.5 years. Then he sent a telegram saying he was coming home on leave. The couple planned to marry. He arrived home on the Wednesday night to find that Ada Crow had been killed in that morning's shelling. What was to have been the wedding day turned out to be the funeral day.
And then suddenly it was all over. The shells stopped. People came out of their houses. There was bricks and mortar and debris all over the road, and the house at the end of the street had been hit. We went down there to see it.
Father told Tom to get the Sunbeam car out, and we drove into Scarborough. And of course, when we got to Scarborough, we did see the damage. Nearly everywhere you went, holes in houses, sides knocked out, holes underneath walls, everywhere.
All through the day, casualties were brought into Scarborough Hospital. The hospital building itself was struck by a shell, but doctors and nurses worked on. Eyewitnesses said those with minor injuries willingly made way for the seriously ill. One woman who'd undergone an operation 6 days before left her bed to make way for the injured. The bombardment ended at 8:30, the last shot hitting the lighthouse on Vincent's Pier. It was damaged so seriously that it had to be demolished, to be rebuilt only after the war. The three ships then turned and steamed northward to Whitby. Again, the town's inhabitants were taken by surprise, and few took cover. A coastguard was decapitated by a shell as he stood outside his house, one of the 3 people to die in Whitby. The bombardment lasted 11 minutes. In that time, over 150 shells fell on the town. One shell struck the famous abbey, destroying the arch of the west doorway and the masonry above it. The Abbey Lodge was damaged, and houses and schools in the Meadowfield Park and Fishburn Park districts were also hit. No one in Scarborough knew the raid was over. No one knew that German troops wouldn't follow the ships. So while the local cavalry detachment galloped onto the beach to reassure the populace, the British government hastily dispatched more troops to the area. Rifleman William Reynard of the 8th West Yorkshire Regiment was on manoeuvres near York when a motorcyclist rode up with orders for his commanding officer. The battalion about turned, marched back to York, and then trained for Scarborough.
Half of us went down and dug these trenches against the Grand Hotel, and the other half stopped in the station to clear the station up. Before dawn, must have been sometime about 5 o'clock in the morning, we went into these trenches that we dug for anything that happened, if anything were likely to happen, which it wasn't. What we could do to a gunboat with the .303 rifles, I don't know. But that's all we had. There were no artillery about. After all that, we marched round Scarborough, right on the Marine Drive, and we could see Dutch shells, several Dutch shells in the Castle Hill. And when we marched all round Scarborough, and right round, it must have been about altogether a 4-mile march, you see. We marched in fighting order with rifles, you see, and that was to let the people see that we had something to fire with, so that they wouldn't do any harm with the rifles, only to kill a man.
19 people died in the bombardment of Scarborough, and 80 were injured. More than 200 buildings were damaged or destroyed. While the timing of the raid may have reduced the number of deaths and injuries, the confusion which followed the first explosions could have increased the casualty figures. Some eyewitnesses say that when the first wave of shells fell on the seafront, people rushed up into the town and were caught by a second bombardment falling further inland. The Germans also left a deadly legacy here in Scarborough, because the cruisers had dropped mines out here in the harbour. In the months to come there were tragedies as fishing vessels and other vessels struck those mines. The worst tragedy was on Christmas Day, just 9 days after the shelling. A minesweeper struck a mine just 6 miles offshore. 6 men were killed. There are many unanswered questions about the raid. Perhaps the main one is why the Germans chose to bombard the 3 ports at all. Scarborough wasn't a military target, and the loss of life, the injuries, tragic though they were insignificant compared with the vast number of casualties in other war theatres. The most likely explanation is that the Germans thought the raid would have a propaganda value out of all proportion to either the damage done or the casualties inflicted. Britain was still regarded as the strongest naval power in the world. The shelling of the 3 ports was the first time in more than 100 years that a British town had suffered a naval bombardment. German newspapers greeted the raid as a major victory. Even the press of the United States, which was still neutral in the conflict, didn't outwardly condemn the bombardment. They argued that it exposed serious weaknesses in Britain's naval defences. More than 500 shells fell on Scarborough in that day. In fact, some estimates put the figure as high as 700. This is one that didn't explode. It's 6 inches in diameter, it weighs 80 pounds, and it didn't go off because its fuse fell out on impact. It was found in front of St Mary's Hospital. But in Britain, the banner headlines of papers like the Scarborough Pictorial evoked an angry response throughout the country. Winston Churchill spoke of the baby killers. Such cruel and senseless operations, said one observer, could have been ordered only by the leaders of a nation which had temporarily gone mad. But the rhetoric of both sides was lost on the people of Scarborough. Within days of the bombardment, they were busily repairing the damage and getting on with their work. The Times special correspondent dispatched north to survey the damage was impressed by the resilience of the town's inhabitants. A stranger, he wrote, would have nothing but the broken buildings to tell him that this quiet seaside resort had been subjected to an experience virtually unknown to an English town. Both the Von der Tann and the Derfflinger were damaged at the Battle of Jutland in 1916, and they were scuttled when the German fleet surrendered at Scapa Flow. A brass plaque from the Derfflinger has, ironically, found its way back to Scarborough, in the possession of a man who was in the Orkneys in the early 1940s, when the German ships were being salvaged. The bombardment of the three towns was one of the first incidents of what came to be known as total war. War fought not between professional armies on foreign soil, but between nations and peoples. And the propaganda wasn't just on the German side. The memory of that raid was exploited in posters urging men to enlist. Remember Scarborough became the watchword of the recruiting officers. Scarborough served to harden the war spirit. And on the people who lived there, the raid left an indelible impression.
We looked through the window. There's nothing to see. Not one glimmer of any sort, just one black patch. No chimneys or anything to be seen. And I said to myself then, well, Scarborough has at last woke up. She was at war.